Corpus Christi, Texas, 1963. The Gulf breeze moved through quiet streets where modest homes lined up in neat rows, their porches lit with the faint glow of yellow bulbs. Among them was the home of 38-year-old Dorothy Miller. She was a familiar figure to her neighbors, always kind, always ready to lend a hand. If someone's child was sick, she brought over soup. If someone needed a tool or a ride to the store, she rarely hesitated. Dorothy's life was steady and uneventful, defined by work, community, and an open heart. She had built her reputation on trust. In an era when people left their doors unlocked, Dorothy embodied the idea of neighborliness. Her home was simple but warm, filled with photographs and knickknacks that spoke to a life rooted in family and routine. Those who knew her described her as generous to a fault, a woman who carried the weight of kindness as her defining trait. Living only a few doors away was Jack Reynolds, a man who had drifted into the neighborhood not long before. Jack kept to himself most of the time, a solitary figure who didn't quite fit into the fabric of the community. He was quiet, sometimes awkward in conversation, and though people didn't know much about him, they mostly shrugged it off. Not everyone is outgoing, they thought. Dorothy, true to her nature, took a different approach. She treated Jack as she treated everyone else, with patience and warmth. She spoke to him on the sidewalk, lent him tools, and invited him over when she thought he might be lonely. Where others kept their distance, Dorothy reached out, but beneath Jack's reserved exterior lay something darker, something none of his neighbors had suspected. He was restless, harboring thoughts that frightened even him. His interactions with Dorothy stirred feelings of resentment and confusion. In his mind, her generosity became something twisted, an opening, a vulnerability he could exploit. For weeks, he nursed violent fantasies. On September 19th, 1963, the ordinary rhythms of the neighborhood played out as usual. Children played in yards, families prepared dinner, and porch lights flickered on as the sun set. At Dorothy's home, things seemed as normal as ever. But then came the knock at her door. Jack Reynolds stood there, claiming he needed help with a minor issue at his place, maybe a broken appliance, maybe a task he couldn't manage alone. Dorothy, never one to question a neighbor in need, let him inside. Moments later, the calm of the evening shattered. Jack produced a knife he had concealed, and in an instant, Dorothy's living room became a crime scene. She screamed, struggling to fight him off. Furniture toppled in the scuffle, and the sound of her desperate cries carried through the walls to nearby homes. But the attack was relentless. Jack stabbed Dorothy again and again, the violence sudden and merciless. By the time the noise subsided, Dorothy lay motionless, her life stolen in the very space where she had once offered safety and comfort. The neighbors who had heard her cries wasted no time. Calls to the police brought officers rushing to the scene. They entered the house to find Dorothy's body sprawled across the living room floor, blood staining the carpet and walls. The sight stunned even the most seasoned officers. The woman, who had been a pillar of kindness in her community, had died in a brutal, senseless attack. Jack didn't get far. Attempting to flee, he was spotted not far from the neighborhood, his clothes visibly marked with blood. He was quickly apprehended, and with him, the knife he had used to kill Dorothy. At the station, detectives pressed him with questions. The evidence was overwhelming. His fingerprints on the weapon, blood on his clothing, neighbors placing him at Dorothy's door. "Under pressure," Jack confessed. There was no clear motive he could articulate, only a tangled explanation of anger, loneliness, and impulse. News of the crime spread quickly through Corpus Christi. Residents struggled to comprehend how someone living among them, someone they saw on the street and waved to, could commit such an atrocity. For Dorothy's friends and family, the grief was compounded by the betrayal. She had let him into her home not out of obligation, but out of kindness. That very generosity had been weaponized against her. The trial began months later, drawing heavy attention from the local press. Jack's defense team attempted to argue that he suffered from severe mental illness, that his mind was fractured enough to excuse his actions or at least lessen the consequences. But the jury was not persuaded. The brutality of the crime, the lack of remorse, and the sheer weight of evidence left little room for doubt. Dorothy had been murdered in cold blood. Jack Reynolds was convicted of murder and sentenced to life imprisonment. The verdict brought a measure of closure, but it could not erase the shadow that had fallen over the community. Neighbors who had once left their doors unlocked began bolting them shut. Conversations that used to take place on front porches grew less frequent, tinged with suspicion. Dorothy's home eventually sold to another family, but whispers of the crime lingered. The living room where she died became a place people avoided talking about. For many, passing by the house was enough to bring back the memory of the night screams pierced the quiet streets. Jack remained in prison for the rest of his life. He did not apologize, did not seek forgiveness, and showed no sign of remorse. His name became a curse in Corpus Christi, a reminder of how quickly a neighbor could turn into something unrecognizable. Dorothy's family kept her memory alive, speaking often about her kindness and the way she lived rather than the way she died. But even in their memories, there was a sharp edge of pain, the knowledge that her compassion had been her undoing. Over the years, the case became one of those stories that older residents told younger ones, not as gossip, but as a warning. It carried a lesson that unsettled the very notion of community. If someone like Dorothy could be targeted, then what did that mean for anyone else? How well do we truly know the people who live beside us? It was a question that lingered long after the trial ended, a question that haunted Corpus Christi for decades. Dorothy Miller believed she was helping a lonely man when she opened her door that night. She could not have imagined she was letting in her killer. The tragedy of her death lies not only in the violence of the act, but in the betrayal of trust it revealed. Neighbors are supposed to represent safety, familiarity, the comfort of community. But on that September evening, in a modest Texas neighborhood, the very idea of what it meant to be a neighbor was shattered forever. Skidmore, Missouri, a place so small it was often described as the kind of town where nothing ever happens. Fields stretch into the horizon. The streets are narrow and familiar, and the few hundred residents all seem to know each other by name. In December of 2004, the town was preparing for Christmas. Lights glowed on porches, church services filled with carols, and the air carried the stillness of winter. Beneath that stillness, however, something sinister was about to unfold. Bobby Jo Stinnett was 23 years old, bright, gentle, and full of anticipation. She lived in a modest home with her husband Zeb and was preparing for one of the most important moments of her life, She was 8 months pregnant with their first child. Bobby Joe loved dogs, particularly rat terriers, and she and Zeb bred them from their home. They connected with buyers and enthusiasts through online forums, chatting with strangers who shared their passion for the breed. For Bobby Joe, these forums weren't just about business. They were about community, and it was there, in those digital conversations, that she encountered the woman who would one day take everything from her. Lisa Montgomery lived just a short drive away. Outwardly, she seemed like any other woman in her mid-30s. She was married, a mother, and appeared to share the same love for dogs. Online, she and Bobby Joe exchanged messages about puppies. Montgomery expressed interest in visiting Bobby Joe's home, framing it as a chance to look at the dogs and perhaps buy one. To Bobby Joe, it was an ordinary interaction. She had no reason to think twice. Skidmore was a place where people still left their doors unlocked, where the threat of violence seemed distant, almost impossible. What Bobby Joe didn't know was that Lisa Montgomery was hiding something. For years, Lisa had lived with deception. She had told people she was pregnant when she wasn't. She invented due dates, bought maternity clothes, and spun elaborate lies. Her reasons were tangled in insecurity and dysfunction. Her marriage had been strained, and she clung to the idea of having a baby as if it were the only way to fix her fractured life. But when those lies began to collapse, when the people around her started to question her supposed pregnancy, Lisa realized she would need proof. In her mind, there was only one way to make the illusion real. She would have to steal a baby. On December 16, 2004, Lisa Montgomery drove to Skidmore. The winter roads were quiet, the fields stripped bare by the season. She carried with her not only a cover story about buying a puppy, but also a plan of violence. In her car was a rope and a kitchen knife. She pulled into Bobby Joe's driveway in the early afternoon and walked up to the house. Bobby Joe, unsuspecting, welcomed her in. The two women spoke for a while about the dogs. At some point, the conversation shifted. Perhaps Lisa's tone changed. Perhaps Bobby Joe sensed something wasn't right. But before she could react, Lisa attacked. She wrapped the rope around Bobby Joe's neck and pulled. The young woman struggled, fighting to breathe, her hands clawing at the cord. Her unborn child made every movement more desperate, every gasp more urgent. But Lisa didn't let go. She squeezed until Bobby Joe collapsed. Then came the act that horrified an entire nation. Lisa retrieved the knife she had brought and cut into Bobby Joe's abdomen. It was crude, violent, and unimaginably painful. Despite her injuries, Bobby Joe regained consciousness during the assault. In her final moments, she screamed for help, a sound that neighbors later recalled but could not place. She begged, fought, and thrashed against the attack. But Lisa pressed on, determined to take the baby. She cut through tissue and muscle until finally she lifted the infant from Bobby Joe's body. The baby girl was alive. Lisa severed the umbilical cord, wrapped the child in a blanket, and fled, leaving Bobby Joe bleeding and dying on her living room floor. Minutes later, Bobby Joe's mother, Becky Harper, arrived. She had been planning to visit her daughter that afternoon. Instead, she walked into a nightmare. The living room was smeared with blood. Bobby Joe lay unconscious, her abdomen mutilated. Becky's frantic 911 call captured the shock and desperation in her voice as she told the dispatcher her daughter was pregnant and her baby was missing. The local police quickly realized the gravity of the situation. This was not just a murder, it was a kidnapping. Time was critical, A newborn, ripped from her mother's womb, could not survive long without care. The FBI joined the search almost immediately, tracing online communications, phone records, and forum messages. They learned about Lisa Montgomery and the arrangements she had made to meet Bobby Joe that day. Meanwhile, Lisa returned home with the baby. She introduced the child to her husband and others as if she had just given birth. People congratulated her. For a moment, she played the role she had been preparing for months, but her deception was already unraveling. Investigators tracked her digital footprints, narrowing down her location within hours. By the next day, December 17th, they had found her. When agents arrived at Lisa Montgomery's home, they found her holding the baby girl. The child was miraculously unharmed. She was taken into protective custody, later reunited with Bobby Joe's grieving family. Bobby Joe, however, had died from her injuries. A young life full of promise, a mother preparing for the future, cut down in her own home by someone she had treated as a neighbor and friend. The nation reacted with shock. The details of the crime spread across newspapers and television screens. The brutality of the act, strangling a pregnant woman, performing a makeshift cesarean, and stealing her baby, seemed almost beyond comprehension. Skidmore, already infamous for the vigilante killing of Ken Rex McElroy 2 decades earlier, was once again thrust into the spotlight for violence that defied understanding. Lisa Montgomery was charged with federal kidnapping resulting in death, a capital offense. Her trial began in 2007, and the courtroom became a battleground of horror and defense. Prosecutors painted a picture of a calculating woman who had planned her crime meticulously, luring Bobby Joe into a false sense of safety before carrying out a monstrous act. The defense argued that Lisa suffered from severe mental illness, that her history of abuse and trauma had fractured her mind beyond repair. They described years of torment at the hands of her stepfather and mother, painting her not as a cold-blooded killer, but as a deeply damaged person, acting out of delusion. The jury listened to both sides. They heard the gruesome details of the crime, the 911 call, the medical examiner's testimony about the nature of Bobby Joe's wounds. They also heard about Lisa's troubled past. In the end, they sided with the prosecution. Lisa Montgomery was convicted and sentenced to death. For years, her attorneys filed appeals, citing her mental state and arguing that she should not be executed. The case wound its way through the legal system, drawing attention from advocacy groups, psychologists, and the media. But the gravity of her crime weighed heavily on the courts. In January 2021, after nearly 2 decades of legal battles, Lisa Montgomery was executed by lethal injection at the federal prison in Terre Haute, Indiana. She became the first woman executed by the U.S. federal government in almost 70 years. The aftermath of the crime left scars not only on Bobby Joe's family, but on the entire town of Skidmore. The baby girl, Victoria Joe, survived and was raised by her father and extended family. She grew up shielded from the details of her mother's death, though the story was one the world would never forget. Skidmore itself, a place that once symbolized quiet, rural life, became synonymous with brutality. The town's history now included not just one infamous act of violence, but several, each darker than the last. For those who knew Bobby Joe, her memory remained rooted not in the violence that ended her life, but in the warmth she gave during it. She was remembered as a woman who loved animals, who loved her husband, who was thrilled to become a mother. Her story became a cautionary tale about trust, about the dangers of deception, and about the unimaginable horrors that sometimes lurk behind familiar faces. The question that haunts this case is one without a comforting answer. How could one neighbor look at another, smile, and pretend to be a friend while harboring such monstrous intent? Bobby Joe believed she was opening her door to a fellow dog lover, another woman who shared her interests. Instead, she opened her door to someone who saw her not as a person, but as a means to an end. The brutality of Lisa Montgomery's crime is difficult to comprehend because it violates the most basic human instincts. Communities are built on trust, on the idea that the people living nearby are not enemies but allies. In Skidmore, that trust was shattered on a winter afternoon when one woman's obsession destroyed another's future. Today, Bobby Joe's story is told not only as a crime, but as a tragedy that reminds us of vulnerability, of how fragile the boundary between safety and danger can be. In a town where everyone knew each other, the person who appeared to be a friend, a neighbor, a fellow member of the community became the source of unthinkable horror. The echo of that betrayal remains, chilling and unforgettable. Wichita, Kansas. For decades, it was a city that prided itself on being safe, grounded, and ordinary. Families lived in quiet suburbs, the children rode bikes down tree-lined streets, and neighbors gathered at barbecues without thinking twice about the people around them. But hidden in that calm exterior was a predator who used the very fabric of trust and community as his camouflage. He was a neighbor, a church leader, a husband, and a father. By day, he was a man people thought they could rely on. By night, he was something else entirely. His name was Dennis Rader, but the world would come to know him by the three letters he gave himself: BTK, bind, torture, kill. The story begins in 1974. On January 15th, a family was murdered inside their modest home in Wichita. Joseph and Julie Otero, along with two of their children, Joseph Jr. and Josephine, were found dead. They had been strangled. The crime scene was horrific, leaving investigators shaken. Nothing about it seemed random. The killer had entered with purpose, controlled the situation, and left without being caught. In those first days, police believed the family had been targeted, perhaps for personal reasons. What they didn't yet realize was that this was only the beginning. At the same time, across town, neighbors greeted each other at church services and local stores, unaware that the man responsible was among them. Dennis Rader lived in Park City, just outside Wichita, with his wife and children. He worked ordinary jobs, first at a hardware store, later as a compliance officer, a job that gave him a small taste of authority over his community. He was active in his church, even serving as president of the Congregation Council. To those who knew him, he was structured, serious, and sometimes overly rigid, but nothing about him screamed danger. He was the type of neighbor who reminded you to mow your lawn or keep your dog on a leash. No one imagined that the man they waved to on Sunday mornings had just wiped out an entire family. But Dennis Rader was not impulsive. He was methodical, deliberate, and obsessed with control. Killing wasn't just about violence for him, it was about ritual. He stalked his victims carefully, watching their routines, learning when they were home, and planning his attacks with meticulous detail. The Otero family was his first. They would not be his last. Months after the Otero murders, Rader claimed another victim. Catherine Bright, a young woman, stabbed and strangled in her own home. Her brother was attacked as well, but managed to survive, giving police a partial description of the assailant. Still, the investigation went nowhere. The idea of a serial killer roaming Wichita seemed unthinkable. That changed when Rader began sending letters. In October 1974, nearly a year after the Otero murders, he left a note inside a book at the Wichita Public Library. In it, he took responsibility for the crimes. The note was chilling, filled with spelling errors, but heavy with menace. He wrote, "I did it myself with no one's help. He's a monster in me." He demanded recognition, taunting police and the media, signing the letter with the name he had chosen for himself. BTK, bind them, torture them, kill them. The city of Wichita erupted in fear. People who had never locked their doors began double bolting them. Women checked the back seats of their cars before driving. Parents no longer allowed their children to walk alone to school. The image of the faceless BTK killer hung over every household, every shadow on the street, every knock at the door. For years, Rader kept killing. In 1977, he murdered Shirley Vian and Nancy Fox, both strangled in their homes. He called the police after Nancy's death, his voice calm and cold as he reported what he had done. "You will find a homicide at 843 South Pershing," he said before hanging up. The line between his public persona and his secret life blurred more and more, but still no one suspected him. At church, he helped organize activities and guided children through religious programs. At home, he played the role of strict but responsible father. He was the man down the street who enforced neighborhood codes, knocking on doors to tell people their grass was too long or their dog was barking too loudly. He was the man who attended local barbecues and gave polite waves across driveways. He blended so seamlessly into the fabric of Wichita that the thought of him being BTK was beyond comprehension. Rader relished the fear he caused. The letters became a hallmark of his crimes, each one taunting investigators, describing his methods, and demanding credit. He wrote about his fantasies, about the way he stalked his projects, as he called them. He enjoyed not just killing, but the performance of killing, the theater of it. And every letter reminded Wichita that the killer was still out there, still watching, still waiting. For the police, the investigation was maddening. They had a voice on the phone, letters in handwriting, crime scenes meticulously examined, and survivors who had caught glimpses of him. But Rader was careful. He didn't leave behind enough evidence to tie him to the crimes. He knew how to avoid suspicion, how to slip back into the role of ordinary neighbor and church leader. For nearly 30 years, the BTK case haunted law enforcement. Then, in 1991, the killings suddenly stopped. For over a decade, silence fell over Wichita. Some began to believe the killer had died or moved away or perhaps been imprisoned for another crime. Life slowly returned to normal. People unlocked their doors again. Children played outside without constant fear. The shadow of BTK began to fade. But Dennis Rader hadn't gone anywhere. He had simply stopped killing. His urges remained, but his life had changed. His children were growing older, his responsibilities increased, and he found satisfaction in revisiting his past crimes through notes, drawings, and photographs he kept hidden. For years, the monster stayed quiet. Then, in 2004, a local newspaper ran a story about the BTK case reflecting on the 30-year anniversary of the Otero murders. The article suggested that BTK had been forgotten, that perhaps he was no longer alive. For Dennis Rader, it was the perfect insult. He couldn't stand the idea of being erased, of his name fading into history. And so he reemerged. He began sending packages again, letters, photos, and even items taken from crime scenes decades earlier. One package included a victim's driver's license sealed in an envelope, proof that he was still alive, still watching. The fear returned to Wichita overnight. Families who thought BTK was gone now had to confront the fact that he had been there all along. But this time, technology had advanced, police had better tools, and Dennis Rader, arrogant in his belief that he could outsmart them, made a fatal mistake. In 2005, he sent a floppy disk to a local television station believing it couldn't be traced. On the disk, investigators found metadata linking it to the Christ Lutheran Church in Park City. The name Dennis Rader appeared in the file information. Police moved quickly. They compared DNA from Rader's daughter to evidence collected from the BTK crime scenes years earlier. It was a match. On February 25th, 2005, officers arrested Dennis Rader during his lunch break, pulling him over in his black Jeep Cherokee. The man who had terrorized Wichita for decades, who had blended into the community as a devoted family man and church leader, was finally in custody. When confronted, Rader confessed with chilling ease. He spoke calmly, even proudly, about his crimes. He described in detail how he had stalked his victims, how he bound them, how he took his time to torture and kill them. He showed no remorse, only satisfaction that he was being recognized for his work. In court, his demeanor shocked observers. He described his murders as if he were reciting a grocery list, methodically and without emotion. He pleaded guilty to 10 counts of first-degree murder. In August 2005, he was sentenced to 10 consecutive life terms, ensuring he would die in prison. As he was led away, families of his victims watched, some in tears, others in stunned silence. The mask had finally slipped. The man they thought they knew as neighbor, as church leader, as the quiet figure on the street, was revealed to be one of America's most notorious serial killers. The aftermath of the case left scars on Wichita that remain to this day. Residents who had once prided themselves on community and trust struggled with the knowledge that BTK had lived among them for decades, undetected. He had attended church picnics, waved at children, and lectured neighbors about trivial violations, all while secretly harboring the darkest impulses imaginable. The chilling lesson of Dennis Rader's double life is one that unsettles the very idea of safety. How well can we ever truly know the people around us? What does it mean when the monster isn't a stranger lurking in the shadows, but the man who lives down the street, the one who shakes your hand after Sunday service? For Wichita, those questions never fully go away. Dennis Rader, the BTK killer, remains in prison in Kansas, where he's expected to spend the rest of his life. His crimes, his arrogance, and his ability to hide in plain sight serve as a haunting reminder of the darkness that can hide behind the most ordinary faces. In Wichita, the memory of BTK is not just the story of a serial killer. It is the story of trust shattered, of neighbors who discovered that the man next door could be capable of unspeakable horror. Japan, 1988. In the quiet suburban neighborhood of Misato, north of Tokyo, people lived in an atmosphere that was often described as orderly, respectful, and safe. Neighbors exchanged polite bows. Students in pressed uniforms cycled to and from school, and the streets in the evenings were filled with the faint sound of televisions humming behind closed doors. It was the kind of place where parents didn't fear for their children, walking home where crime felt distant and unimaginable. But beneath the surface of that safe exterior, behind the doors of an ordinary-looking house, one of the most brutal crimes in Japan's history was unfolding. A teenage girl, only 17 years old, was held captive, tortured, and ultimately murdered by boys who were supposed to be her peers. Her name was Junko Furuta. To her friends, she was known as cheerful, kind, and ambitious. To the world, she would become known as the girl in the concrete. Junko Furuta was like many other teenagers. She loved pop music, enjoyed spending time with her friends, and dreamed of a future where she could work, perhaps marry, and live a peaceful life. She was responsible, dedicated to her studies, and avoided trouble. Teachers described her as diligent and polite, while her classmates often said she was someone who lifted the mood of a room simply by being in it. She wasn't involved in gangs or delinquent behavior. She wasn't the type of girl who sought danger. But in November of 1988, fate placed her in the path of 4 boys who had already fallen deeply into the shadows of violence and crime. The leader of the group was 18-year-old Hiroshi Miyano, a boy with a reputation for trouble. He had connections to the Yakuza, the Japanese mafia, which made him feared among his peers. He thrived on intimidation, using his associations to bully and control others. Along with his accomplices, Shinji Minato, Joe Ogura, and Yasushi Watanabe, Miyano lived in a world where cruelty was a form of entertainment and violence was a way to prove dominance. They were young, but already capable of extreme depravity. On November 25th, 1988, Junko Furuta was on her way home from her part-time job at a local store. She never made it. Miyano and his accomplices had been roaming the area looking for trouble when they spotted her. Using a plan that seemed casual but was meticulously cruel, Miyano instructed one of his friends to kick Junko off her bicycle as she rode past. The boy obeyed, and Junko crashed to the ground. Pretending to be concerned, Miyano approached, offering to walk her home safely. Grateful for the kindness, Junko agreed. She had no reason to suspect that the boy standing beside her was already plotting her abduction. Instead of taking her home, Miyano led her to a warehouse where he revealed his true intentions. He threatened her with violence, boasting about his Yakuza connections, and then called his friends. Together, they forced Junko into a house belonging to Shinji Minato's parents. It was there, in an ordinary residential neighborhood where people passed by every day, that Junko's nightmare began. The boys told Minato's parents that Junko was Miyano's girlfriend In Japanese culture at the time, young people often socialized privately, and it wasn't unusual for teenage boys to bring girlfriends home. The Minato family accepted the story. But even when signs of trouble became clear, Junko's presence for weeks at a time, her visible injuries, her silence, the parents turned a blind eye. Whether it was out of fear of Miyano's Yakuza ties or sheer unwillingness to intervene, their silence allowed the crime to continue. Neighbors, too, noticed unusual activity in the home, but no one reported it. The atmosphere of politeness and non-interference that defined Japanese suburban life became a shield for the perpetrators. What followed over the next 44 days was unrelenting cruelty. The boys tortured Junko daily. They beat her with fists and weapons. They burned her skin with cigarettes and lighters. They forced her to drink large amounts of alcohol and eat things no human should be forced to eat. They sexually assaulted her repeatedly, sometimes inviting other acquaintances to the house to participate. At one point, more than a dozen people knew of her captivity, yet no one helped her. Junko endured unimaginable suffering. Her body was broken down piece by piece. Her bones were fractured. Her face was swollen beyond recognition. Her spirit, however, refused to fully break. Survivors of the case later testified that despite the pain, Junko begged her captors to let her live. She told them she wanted to go back to school. She promised she would not tell anyone. Her pleas fell on deaf ears. For the boys, her suffering had become a form of entertainment, a way to show power, to laugh in the face of humanity. During her captivity, Junko attempted escape more than once. On one occasion, she managed to reach a telephone to call for help, but she was caught before the call could connect. Each attempt only led to more severe punishment. As the days stretched into weeks, her condition worsened. She became unable to stand, unable to move without pain. Still, no one intervened. On January 4th, 1989, after 44 days of torture, Junko's body could take no more. She succumbed to her injuries. She was only 17 years old. Panic struck the boys. They had not planned for her death, only her continued suffering. To cover their crime, they placed her body inside a drum filled with concrete and abandoned it in a warehouse in Koto, Tokyo. The act was intended to erase her existence, to bury the evidence of what they had done. For a time, it worked. Junko's disappearance remained a mystery, and her parents searched desperately, putting up missing posters, appealing for information, clinging to hope that their daughter would be found alive. But secrets have a way of surfacing. Months later, police, investigating another crime, arrested Miyano. During interrogation, one of the accomplices let slip details about Junko. Investigators followed the lead, eventually locating the concrete drum. When they cracked it open, the sight was almost unbearable. Inside, they found the remains of Junko Furuta, preserved in the gray cement, a silent witness to the horror she had endured. The discovery sent shockwaves through Japan. The press dubbed her the concrete-encased high school girl, a name that carried both tragedy and outrage. The public demanded justice. But when the trial began, what followed would only deepen the anger. The boys were tried as juveniles, despite the brutality of their crime. Despite the suffering they had inflicted, the Japanese legal system at the time allowed leniency for offenders under the age of 20. Hiroshi Miyano, the leader, received a sentence of 20 years in prison. His accomplices received even lighter sentences, ranging from 5 to 9 years. For Junko's parents, the punishments were an unbearable insult. Their daughter had been subjected to 44 days of agony, yet her killers would walk free while still young enough to rebuild their lives. Public outrage was immediate. The case became a symbol of the failures of Japan's juvenile justice system. Newspapers published the real names of the perpetrators, defying the usual protections of anonymity for juvenile offenders. Citizens argued that the crimes were too severe for the boys to be treated as children. The names Hiroshi Miyano, Joe Ogura, Shinji Minato, and Yasushi Watanabe became infamous, forever linked to cruelty beyond comprehension. For Junko's family, life never returned to normal. Her parents, devastated by grief, lived under the weight of what their daughter had endured. They struggled to forgive themselves for not being able to protect her, even though there was nothing they could have done. Every photograph of Junko, the smiling girl in her school uniform, the cheerful teenager who dreamed of a future, became a haunting reminder of a life stolen in the most brutal way imaginable. The house where she had been imprisoned was eventually demolished, but for years, locals remembered it as a place of shadows, a site where unspeakable cruelty had occurred, while the world outside carried on in silence. The neighborhood, once ordinary, became infamous. As for the perpetrators, their lives after prison were marked by infamy. Some were arrested again for new crimes. None escaped the stigma of what they had done. Their names remained etched into the collective memory of Japan, a permanent scar on the notion of youthful delinquency. Junko Furuta's story continues to resonate decades later, not only because of the unimaginable suffering she endured, but because of what it revealed about the fragility of trust and the dangers of indifference. Neighbors heard noises. Parents saw the girl in their house. Friends noticed her disappearance. Yet no one acted. Silence, politeness, and fear created the conditions that allowed cruelty to thrive unchecked. The legacy of her case is not just about the cruelty of 4 boys. It is about the silence of those who knew and did nothing. The structures of society that failed to protect a girl who deserved safety, and the injustice of a system that valued the futures of her killers over the life that was taken. Junko Furuta was 17 years old when she died. She should have been remembered as a woman who grew into her dreams, who pursued a career, who laughed with friends, who loved and was loved in return. Instead, she became a symbol of innocence destroyed by cruelty, a reminder of how quickly the ordinary can become a nightmare. Her story is retold not to sensationalize, but to ensure she is not forgotten. In every retelling, Junko's name is spoken not just as a victim, but as a girl who deserved to live. England, 1991. In the small market town of Grantham, Lincolnshire, life followed the rhythm of a rural community. Families lived quietly, children walked to school along tree-lined streets, and the local hospital, Grantham and Kesteven, was trusted as a place of safety and healing. For parents, bringing their children to the hospital was an act of faith, an assurance that professionals would do everything possible to protect the most vulnerable. But inside the hospital's pediatric ward, a quiet horror was taking shape, one that would leave families shattered and a nation reeling. At the center of it was a young nurse named Beverly Allitt, a woman whose crimes would later earn her the name the Angel of Death. Beverly Allitt seemed unremarkable at first glance. Born in 1968, she grew up in the small village of Corby Glen. Her childhood wasn't marked by poverty or trauma, but by a peculiar need for attention. From a young age, she sought sympathy by feigning illnesses. Teachers and classmates noticed her bandages, casts, and frequent visits to doctors, yet medical examinations rarely confirmed her complaints. As she grew older, her pattern continued. She was often in and out of hospitals herself, drawing attention from staff and peers. Psychologists later suspected that she suffered from a condition known as Munchausen syndrome, where an individual fabricates or induces illness to gain sympathy. But in Beverly's case, the desire for control and recognition would take a darker form. By her early 20s, Allitt had trained as a nurse. Her colleagues described her as odd, sometimes secretive, sometimes overly eager to insert herself into crises. She was not particularly skilled or competent, but she managed to secure a position on the pediatric ward of Grantham and Kesteven Hospital. To parents, she was just another nurse in a pale uniform. To doctors, she was a staff member who seemed calm during emergencies. No one suspected that beneath her soft-spoken exterior was a mind capable of calculated cruelty. The ward where Beverly worked was filled with the sounds of children, toddlers giggling, babies crying, the low murmur of televisions playing cartoons. Parents sat by bedside chairs, exhausted but relieved that their children were under professional care. Nurses moved between rooms, administering medications, checking charts, and offering comfort. In this environment, Beverly Allitt thrived, not because she cared for children, but because she found in the ward a stage for her need to control life and death. Between February and April of 1991, a series of medical emergencies began to unfold. Children who had been admitted with minor illnesses suddenly deteriorated without explanation. On February 21st, 7-month-old Liam Taylor was admitted with a chest infection. His condition was stable and doctors expected a straightforward recovery. But while under Allitt's care, Liam suddenly stopped breathing. Alarms rang, staff rushed to resuscitate him, and Beverly was at the center of the chaos. Despite their efforts, Liam died. His death was a shock, but in pediatrics, tragedy was not unheard of. Doctors attributed it to complications. Parents grieved, trusting that everything possible had been done. Just 2 weeks later, another child arrived, 11-year-old Timothy Hardwick, who had cerebral palsy but was otherwise healthy. Within hours of being admitted, Timothy collapsed. Beverly was the first nurse on the scene. Despite attempts to revive him, he died. 2 sudden deaths in such a short time began to unsettle some staff, but coincidences in medicine can be deceptive. Once again, no one suspected deliberate harm. Then came 2-year-old Kaylee Desmond. She was admitted with a minor chest infection. Under Beverly's watch, she suddenly went into cardiac arrest. This time, resuscitation was successful. Kaylee survived, but her parents were left bewildered as to how their daughter's condition had spiraled so quickly. Doctors had no answers. By March, the pattern was accelerating. 5-year-old Bradley Gibson, like the others, suffered a sudden heart attack. He was revived, but blood tests revealed something unusual: high levels of insulin. Bradley had never required insulin. His collapse had not been natural. It was a red flag, but one that was not immediately acted upon. Another child, 2-year-old Yik-Hung Chan, experienced a similar collapse. He survived, but again there were no clear answers. Each time Beverly was present, often the first to notice symptoms, the first to call for help, the one at the bedside when catastrophe struck. Her colleagues began to remark on her uncanny presence during crises, but suspicion had not yet turned to accusation. The turning point came in April with the admission of 15-month-old Claire Peck. Claire was asthmatic but stable. She was placed in Beverly's care. Minutes later, she suffered a heart attack. Doctors resuscitated her. Moments after being returned to Beverly's supervision, Claire collapsed again. This time, she could not be revived. Tests revealed extremely high levels of insulin in her system. Claire's death was no longer explainable as coincidence. Something unnatural was happening inside the hospital walls. Whispers began among staff. How could so many emergencies cluster around one nurse's shifts? Why were insulin levels elevated in children who had no medical need for it? Investigators were called in. They had handed their children over to her care, believing she was a protector, only to learn she was their executioner. Photographs of the children were shown. Testimonies were read. Doctors described the confusion they had felt as one child after another collapsed under suspicious circumstances. The weight of evidence was undeniable. In May 1993, Beverly Allitt was found guilty on 13 charges of murder and attempted murder. She was sentenced to 13 life terms in prison, one of the harshest sentences handed down to a woman in British history. The judge described her crimes as evil beyond belief, yet even after the verdict, unease lingered. How had she been able to operate undetected for so long? Why had no one acted sooner when the pattern became clear? For the parents, the answers were cold comfort. Their children were gone, stolen by the very system they had trusted most. Beverly was sent to Rampton Secure Hospital, a high-security psychiatric facility. She was diagnosed with several personality disorders, including factitious disorder, which supported the theory that she harmed children to satisfy her own psychological needs. Decades later, she remains incarcerated, her name a symbol of betrayal and cruelty. The legacy of her crimes was profound. Hospitals across the UK implemented stricter monitoring systems. Access to medications like insulin became tightly controlled. Pediatric wards adopted new protocols to detect unusual patterns of medical emergencies. Beverly's actions had exposed a terrifying vulnerability: that trust in caregivers could be exploited with devastating consequences. For the families of her victims, the pain never subsided. Each birthday that never came, each empty bed, each photograph of a smiling child who should have grown into adulthood became a reminder of what had been taken. Some of the survivors live with permanent disabilities caused by her injections, their lives forever altered by the actions of a nurse who should have protected them. In Grantham, the community struggled to reconcile the horror. The hospital, once a place of safety, was now remembered as the site of betrayal. Parents hesitated to trust again. Nurses who had worked alongside Beverly lived with guilt, asking themselves if they should have seen more, done more, spoken sooner. The story of Beverly Allitt endures not just because of its brutality, but because of its violation of trust. Nurses are symbols of compassion, guardians of the sick, protectors of the vulnerable. In harming children, Beverly shattered that image. She turned a place of healing into a place of death. Her crimes ask a haunting question. How do we ever truly know the intentions of those we trust with our lives and the lives of our children? For the parents of Grantham, that question came too late. For the rest of the world, it lingers as a warning. Beverly Allitt was supposed to be a nurse. Instead, she became one of Britain's most infamous killers, remembered not for the lives she saved, but for the children she took away. Ontario, Canada, 2007, a quiet suburban street in Mississauga looked like any other. Neatly trimmed lawns, family sedans parked in driveways, and neighbors who exchanged polite greetings but rarely pried too deeply into each other's lives. For Aqsa Parvez, a 16-year-old girl who lived in one of those houses, the suburban calm hid a storm brewing inside her home. Her death would expose not just a crime of violence, but a clash of cultures, values, and expectations that reverberated across Canada and beyond. It was not a crime committed by strangers nor by random chance. It was carried out by the very people she should have been able to trust the most: her own family, her father, and brother. Aqsa was born in Pakistan in 1991 and moved to Canada with her family when she was young. She grew up between two worlds, the traditional values of her conservative Muslim household and the modern freedoms of the Canadian society around her. At school, Aqsa blended in with her peers. She wore jeans, listened to Western music, and wanted to live like the other girls she knew. She dreamed of independence, of a life where she could make her own choices. But at home, those desires clashed violently with the strict rules imposed by her father, Muhammad Parvez. From an early age, Aqsa was told what she could and could not wear, where she could and could not go. Her father insisted she wear the hijab, the headscarf, and abide by his interpretation of modesty. Aqsa resisted. She wanted to dress like her friends, to cut her hair shorter, to express herself. Arguments in the Parvez household grew louder and more frequent. Teachers and classmates noticed the tension. Aqsa sometimes confided in her friends, telling them she was under constant pressure at home, that she wanted to escape. She even stayed with friends at times, running away temporarily to avoid the suffocating control. Each time, her family brought her back, and the cycle began again. To her classmates, Aqsa was lively, outgoing, and ambitious. She wanted to work, to build her own future. She was not reckless or irresponsible, but she wanted freedom, the freedom to choose her clothing, her friends, her path. In another family, her struggles might have been typical teenage rebellion. In hers, they became life and death. On December 10th, 2007, the conflict reached its breaking point. Aqsa had left her home once more after a heated argument with her parents. She stayed briefly with a friend who later said Aqsa feared returning. She was tired of fighting, tired of being controlled. But Aqsa also carried guilt and a hope that things might change. On that December morning, she agreed to go back. Her father picked her up. What happened afterward remains chilling. Later that day, at around 7 a.m., a 911 call was placed. It was Muhammad Parvez himself calling authorities to report what he had done. Some labeled Aqsa's murder an honor killing, a term used to describe crimes where family members kill relatives, often women, for supposedly bringing shame through behavior deemed inappropriate. Her story became a rallying point. Advocacy groups used her case to highlight the struggles faced by young women caught between cultural expectations and personal freedoms. Campaigns emerged to ensure schools, social workers, and law enforcement would listen more closely to teenagers in distress, to take seriously their cries for help. Aqsa's death, though tragic, became a call to action. Her father and brother remained in prison, their names infamous across Canada. In interviews, family members outside the immediate household struggled with the shame and disbelief of what had happened. Some defended cultural traditions, others condemned the violence. The divide mirrored the national conversation. How do societies respect cultural backgrounds while protecting the fundamental rights of individuals, especially young women? In the years since, Aqsa's story has been retold in classrooms, documentaries, and discussions about human rights. Each retelling carries the same haunting truth. She was 16, full of life, and wanted to be free. She should have had decades ahead of her to choose her path, to make her mistakes, to grow. Instead, her life ended on the floor of her own home, at the hands of those who should have loved her most. Walking through Mississauga today, the neighborhood where Aqsa lived looks unchanged. Children still walk to school, families still gather for barbecues, the lawns are still neatly trimmed. But for those who remember, the air carries a shadow. The house where she died is just another house now, but for many it is impossible to see it without remembering the girl who never got the chance to grow up. Aqsa Parvez's death is a reminder of the dangers that exist not only in the shadows of alleys or the hands of strangers, but within the walls of a family home. It forces us to ask the painful question, how do we ensure that the very places meant to protect us do not become the sites of our greatest vulnerability? Aqsa wanted to live. Her crime, in the eyes of her father and brother, was wanting freedom. For the rest of the world, the crime was theirs, and the shame rests with them, not with her. Which of these cases shocked you the most? Let us know in the comments